Okay. Thank you for coming. I'm John Nelson. I'm a Master Gardener Volunteer with Monroe County. We're going to talk about gardening with native plants today. And if you're wondering what's been on the title slide, that's butterfly weed. It's a type of milkweed that monarchs will use. This is stiff goldenrod, and this is blue lobelia. And you can see all of them have lots of pollinators on them. So they're great native plants for the garden. So kind of good. Why we grow native plants, of course, is many of you want more wildlife habitat. You want to attract more pollinators, more birds, more insects, and they're all good for that. They're also great, and they tend to be less maintenance than a lot of the non-native plants because they're adapted to our local environment. They don't need as much water and fertilizer. They often don't need any pesticides because they're adapted to the insects that we have. So they're often an easier plant to grow than the exotics. They also, of course, by definition, are not invasive because a native plant can't be invasive. Some are aggressive spreaders, and I'll mention that as along the way as we go, but none of them are invasive. You can get a native plant for anywhere, just like, because they grow everywhere in the woods and wild around us. So whether it's sunny or shady or dry or wet, you can find a native plant to grow absolutely any place in your yard. And of course, they are beautiful. So they really have all the benefits you want for a garden plant. We do have to remember always the right plant in the right place. If you take a plant that grows in a swamp and try and put it in the middle of a dry yard, it's not going to be happy. Or if it's something that likes sandy soil and we put it in our heavy clay, that won't be very good. We do have to watch for a few invasive insects and diseases. So I just mentioned, hemlock woolly adelgid. I mean, hemlocks are wonderful trees, but I wouldn't recommend them right now because the adelgid will kill the tree unless you spend a lot of money on treatment. Likewise, of course, we all know that all the ash trees are gone because of emerald ash borer. I'm a little nervous about sudden oak wilt. It's not in this area yet, but it makes me a little nervous about oak trees. So there are always a few invasive insects. We can talk about a few others, but so that's always a slight concern. The other thing with growing native plants is we have to accept that our gardens aren't going to look perfect because there are insects and various things that do nibble on them. And that's a good thing. I mean, if monarch caterpillars eat my milkweed foliage, I'll be very happy. So we have to recognize that the gardens are not going to look perfect, and that's fine. And that usually our native plants are fine with this. The one exception I'll make is that we sometimes have to protect them from deer, particularly when they're young, because we have too many deer. They evolved in an ecosystem that didn't have as many deer as we have now because there were wolves and other things around to keep the deer numbers under control. We took out the predators. Now we have deer everywhere, as you all know, living out here. So we do sometimes have to protect our native plants from deer, particularly when they're young. I should mention, Kelly early next week is going to send you a copy of all my slides. So you'll get a copy of all these slides. You'll also get a native plant list. The native plant list does include deer resistance. So it does have a 4-level deer resistance scale and to tell you which of these plants are most susceptible to deer browse. Okay, we've been talking about native plants. So what is a native plant? What does it mean to be a native plant? How do we define that? There's an official definition that says a plant that's been part of nature for hundreds of thousands of years in a particular region of ecosystem, and only plants that were here before European settlement are called native. So the question is this underlying thing, what's that particular region or ecosystem that we're going to call a native plant? We could be really, really strict and say it's a plant native or source within 50 miles of Monroe County. And if I did that, there would probably be no native plants in the nursery outside or most other places. But I should mention that if people doing habitat restoration, this is the definition they try and aim for. So if somebody's restoring a wetland or restoring a meadow, they aim for this. For those of us in our gardens, that's just not practical. So they can say, plants native to Finger Lakes or plants native to New York. Those are good definitions. We can start going broader, northeastern US, Great Lakes, the whole eastern US. That gets us more plants to work with, but some plants actually in the eastern US are invasive here in New York. So if we open the window too wide, we can actually bring in some problems. So we're going to typically aim for that top part. And what as the master gardeners are recommending is native to New York, suitable for USDA Zone 6, our zone. That's going to exclude some Long Island natives that just wouldn't do up here because we're too cold. There is a New York Flora Atlas website you can go to check the status of any plant. So that's the end. That can tell you, is this native to New York or not? We are, and I'll talk about this later in the talk, you can add a few plants from the northeastern US, mainly from Pennsylvania and stuff, that it will grow well here. Our native insects and birds know them. And as we get into climate change, they should be well adapted here. So I'll talk about some of those toward the end of the talk. So that's the definition of a native. When you start going to nurseries, you'll start running into all sorts of other interesting things. Some of them are good, some are marketing. So let's start with variety. That actually is a technical term. It's just a natural variation. It's found in nature. It breeds true from seed. It's just that in nature, so the example I use is Solomon seal. There are two different native Solomon seal here in New York. They're both wonderful shade plants. I'll show you some pictures later. One is smaller than the other, and they're different varieties. So so if you see variety on the tag, it's usually abbreviated VAR. That just means it's a natural variety found in nature. And it's just kind of a naming thing. Instead of making it a whole separate species, they just made it a variety. And they're perfectly wonderful native plants for your garden. Where it gets trickier and marketing enters is we get into cultivars. And that's what it means to cultivate a variety. It means it's something where people got involved. There's two types, hybrids and nativars. We'll talk about them separately because they're very different. And I should mention, these are getting very popular because native plants are getting very popular. I mean, all of you are here and there's more people on Zoom. A native plant can't be patented as a plant patent because it's found in nature. So anybody can sell a native plant. So to be honest, the profit margin on native plants is not as high. If you create a cultivar, you can get a plat patent for it, and then only you can sell it, and you can charge a higher price and get a higher profit margin. So as native plants get more popular, there's lots of activities in this space and lots of marketing in this space. So hybrids are a genetic cross between two species. Pretty much always people do that. It doesn't breed true, so it's usually propagated by cuttings or divisions. A nativar, on the other hand, it's been selectively bred. So they take a species, let's pick an example, maybe it's a grass that has a black stripe. And they find a plant in nature that has where the black stripe's a little broader. And they selectively just breed that one. And they keep selecting plants that have broader and broader black stripes until they have a grass that's black. I mean, it's the same native species. They haven't crossed it with anything. But I'll call it, unnatural selection. They basically selectively bred it until it has a particular characteristic they can market. So that the goal is basically to make something that's nice for the garden. It looks a little different sitting on the shelf compared to all the other ones. So as I mentioned, hybrids are designed for human appeal. They're not designed for pollinators. So they often have little or no nectar, and they're often more expensive than a native plant. So I call these kind of a lose-lose. You put it in your garden, it's not so good for the pollinators, and it costs you more money out of your wallet. So we consider them not to be very pollinator friendly. So let me give 4 examples here on the bottom from Echinacea. Echinacea is actually not native to New York. It's native to Ohio and parts of the eastern US, but it's one of those eastern natives that we recommend for gardens here. So the native species is Echinacea purpurea. These 4 pictures came from my garden. You can see there's a nice bee there, and there's a bee and some, so it's covered in bees all summer long. This hybrid, Paradisal mix, you can tell it's a hybrid from the name, where it's X hybrida. I got lucky. There's a bee back there. This one, the bee is still like this one. These 2 varieties or hybrids, pink double delight and sundown. I've never seen a bee or any other insect on the whole time I've owned them. Now, as soon as you say pink double delight, notice when they hybridize this one, the center of the flower is all covered in fluff. So the area where the bee would have gone looking for nectar doesn't even have any open spaces anymore. This one looks the same as the others except for color, but I guess in the process of breeding that color, they bred the pollen and the nectar out of it. Yeah.
So the one on the left, that's natural one?
That's the natural one. That is the natural. This is the natural found in nature one. More nectar, more pollen, everything. So garden-wise, I admitted to you, I own all 4 of these. So I'm not saying don't ever buy them. And they make lovely, if you're trying to make a nice cut flower display for your kitchen table or something, the variety and color and stuff is very nice. But I have a huge swath of this. I only have 3 of each of these. So, grow lots of this, but, certainly for pretty bouquets or if something strikes your fancy as you're shopping the plants, you certainly buy it and enjoy it. But if you're trying to create a pollinator garden, aim more to stick with the straight species. So what about nativars? As I said, if that's a cultivated variety, they start with a native, they breed for a desired trait. It takes them multiple generations to do this. And then the final plant, they propagate from cuttings or divisions, and they get a nice patent on it, and they're all set. So the question is, are these of any use to pollinators? It is still the same native species, but it's not a variation likely to occur naturally. It might not survive in a natural environment. And I don't have a definitive answer for you here. This has become a new trend. As native plants have gotten more popular, creating native varieties has gotten to be a big thing for the nursery industry. There are lots of companies creating these all the time. So what do we know so far? Doug Tallamy, who some of you may know is a book author, who's worked a lot in this space. He and his grad students took a bunch of trees with foliage variations, because there's a lot. If you look at, there'll be trees that are more purple or more golden or more green. And what they found, if you make the foliage red or purple or darker, it has fewer caterpillars on it as a host plant. Many of these trees and shrubs are host plants. You make the foliage in that direction, it has less use as a host plant. And the guess is that the pigment that gives it that color probably makes the foliage taste bad, and the caterpillars or insects that would use it as a host don't. Interestingly, if you make the foliage variegated, those white-green variations you see in nursery, it had no difference. It was just as good as a host plant. A few were even better. You can imagine that the absence of pigments might make the foliage not taste even better. So if you're looking for trees and shrubs, you're trying to attract, still have it be a good host plant for caterpillars, you might stay away from the darker foliage. The Mount Cuba Center did a study on hydrangea arborescens. That's our native hydrangea. If you go shopping for that, you'll find two varieties of flower: a lace cap, that's the native, kind of a flat lace cap, and a mop head. The mop head was a natural variation found in nature, and then lots of native varieties have been bred off of that. So Mount Cuba was curious between the mop heads and the lace caps, which would be better for attracting pollinators. To show why it's going to take a long time to get these answers, they grew a whole field of these hydrangeas, all the different varieties, and they had an army of volunteers. And every day they went out and they went to each plant and they picked a random flower and stared at it for a minute and counted pollinators. And then they went to the next plant. And they did that all summer long, because that's what it took to do the research. The answer is that the mop heads are inferior. They attract by half or less the pollinators of a lace cap. Excuse me, a lace cap. So kind of the lesson here is, if the flower looks a whole lot different than the native flower, like that double echinacea, stay away from flowers that look really different if you want to keep attracting the pollinator. Keep the flower looking roughly the same. So that's what we know so far about getting plants. I would say, it gets a little so you're out in the nursery trying to shop for plants and you're looking at tags and stuff. It can get overwhelming. I often end up getting out my phone and trying to Google search this plant to try and figure out what it is. So I could say, we're going to give you a native plant list. I tend to go into nurseries with, looking for specific plants, and I know what the species name is. And when I find these oddball natives and stuff, then the phone comes out and I start Googling and searching, trying to figure it out. Sometimes it works. Sometimes I end up having to do more work when I get home. If we get time afterwards, I have a very confusing plant tag in my notebook from a plant that I got that was very cleverly marketed. But anyway, so I'm not going to get into garden design in detail, because we could do a whole talk on garden design. But if you're trying to make something kind of pollinator, native, bird friendly, look at the garden from how pollinators and birds will look at it. They need shelter. They need multiple layers. You want to think about that. Is there a pathway from the edge of your garden to the flowers? Are there trees and maybe shrubs and maybe taller and shorter plants, so the creatures coming in have a nice shelter path where they can hide someplace from a predator or bad weather? Different canopy levels, being messy, because all these things need leaf litter to nest in, or nest materials for birds to build nests with. So again, this just makes native gardening more less work, because if you're doing less cleanup and you're doing these things, it all gets to be less work and easier to do, which is, I think, a part of the fun. We do want to plant in groups, so that when things flower, there's lots of, it's more efficient for pollinators with clumps of at least 3. Big diversity of plants. We want plants that bloom from spring until fall. I'll kind of talk about it. By the way, the bloom time is also on the spreadsheet you're going to get early next week. But you want to have a mix of plants that start blooming around now, but they keep blooming till mid-August, all the way to a killing frost, because the pollinators and other things are active looking for nectar all that time. If you can leave fallen fruits and stuff, that's great too. Okay, kind of enough introductory stuff. Let's start talking about some actual plants. Let's start with large deciduous trees. So you may not have room for one of these in your yard. Now, maybe if you had if the emerald ash borers killed all the big ash trees in your yard, or something fell over in a windstorm last winter, you may have an opening. So if you have room for a large deciduous tree, there's a lot of great native choices. We have lots, of course, the native maples. They're all wonderful trees. The birches are great. The nice bark, shagbark hickory, tulip poplar. I mentioned these are all host plants. That means they're hosts for butterflies or moths. So a lot of times you may not see this because the accent's all going up high in the canopy. But if you're trying to attract have butterflies in your garden, flowers is half the equation, but the other half is to have the host plant for the caterpillar to live on. And so these big trees are all great for different moths, different butterflies and things. Some more large trees, the black gum, the eastern sycamore. Oaks, of course, are a wonderful host plant. They host many, many insects. Sassafras or linden, those are some linden flowers. All beautiful trees, all great host plants. Just as an example, let's see, the linden will host eastern tiger swallowtails. There's just a whole range of nice butterflies and things you can host in these trees. If you want something that stays green all winter, we have a number of native conifers that will, of course, will hold their needles all winter. The balsam fir, the arborvitae, the white spruce, red pine. This is from the eastern red cedar, the berries it produces. So the only slight caution here is some of these are not real salt tolerant, so you wouldn't want to put some of these too close to a road. You're going to get road spray and stuff on them. But you certainly, if you want, either a privacy fence or some arborvitae or something else, there's a lot of native conifers you can grow in your yard as well. So you may not have room for a big tree. So let's talk about smaller trees and shrubs. You may have room for something a little bit smaller in the yard. Serviceberry is a lovely tree. It's flowering about now with nice white flowers that look like this. Then later in summer, it produces a blueberry that looks kind of like a blueberry. The cedar waxwings adore those. If you have a serviceberry in your yard, and when it ripens up, you'll have a flock of cedar waxwings arrive and just strip it bare. It's a lot of fun to watch. I've been told that the serviceberries make a nice pie if you can get a hold of them. I've never got, but I think you're gonna have to work hard to beat the birds. But it's a great plant. There are a lot of nativars available. And here's, I should mention on nativars, a lot of times in trees and shrubs, they've selected a nativar for size. A lot of these serviceberries are larger trees, but you can get some of them only grow at like 10, 12 feet because they found a variety in nature. It's just the only difference is same flowers, same berries. This happens to be one that grows only to a small size or grows very slowly. So in this case, I would recommend some of the nativars as a way you might get a serviceberry in your yard in a smaller space where the big natural native just wouldn't fit. Chokeberry is another fun one. You can get either red or black. Again, as the host for butterflies and moths. As the name implies, the berries are incredibly tart. Sometimes in health food stores, you see something called aronia juice. This is the Latin name for this plant is aronia. The juice comes from these berries. The juice they sell you, they add a lot of sugar to make it palatable. It is so tart that the berries persist way into winter. That the birds in my yard typically eat it around February. So the nice thing is you have these pretty berries on the tree well into February. And then finally, I don't know if it's enough freeze-thaw cycles or the birds just get hungry enough, but eventually around February, the berries finally disappear. And I've seen robins and other birds hopping through my trees getting them. So that's another very attractive one. They haven't quite bloomed in my yard. I expect they'll bloom within the next week or two. Dogwoods, we have many, many native dogwoods. And so you can find a dogwood for any place in your yard. The flowering dogwood can be the size of a small tree. There's many different nativars available where they play with size and play with flower color a little bit. Pagoda dogwood likes partial shade. Red osier dogwood tolerates wet soils. There's probably like half a dozen or more dogwood species on the list you're going to get. They all produce lovely flowers. They're all host plants. They all can produce berries that the birds love. It's really, pretty much every yard can find a spot where a dogwood would fit. And they're a really attractive native shrub. We talked about the smooth hydrangea, and that's what the lace cap flower looks like. So if you're out shopping for those, there are multiple varieties of lace cap flower available. Spice bush is a host for butterflies and moths. The berries attract birds, has these lovely yellow flowers in the spring. So it's probably getting close to blooming around now. Nine bark is a host for a number of moths that produces these nice little small white flowers. So again, you know, lots of native shrubs that you can put in your garden. I think I've got one more slide of these. Pussy willow is a great one. Again, in terms of something that blooms really early. You know, pussy willow is pretty much done blooming already. It started really early. So this is great when the bumblebees and other pollinators that have overwintered are just coming out of their burrows in the early spring and they need nectar. This is blooming, and being a nice shrub, it's got lots of flowers. So it's got a source for lots of nectar. Viburnums, we have multiple species available for sun or for shade. The berries attract birds, the flowers nice. The only thing I'll caution is we also have the viburnum leaf beetle, which is an invasive insect that goes after viburnums. And if you're having a problem with it, you might have to treat the tree. But so this is another case where an invasive insect could potentially cause some problems for one of our native plants. Okay, let's switch to perennials. And I'm going to start with perennials that grow in the sun and start with ones that bloom early. So these are the ones that start blooming, you know, from early spring to early summer. Red columbine is a really nice plant for like a woodland edge. It grows in the sun, but will also tolerate a little bit of shade. It'll attract hummingbirds as well as lots of pollinators. So it's a very attractive plant for an area that maybe gets just a little bit of shade. Cranesbill geranium can make a really attractive ground color in sun to partial shade. I have this growing underneath some lilacs in my yard. The one thing I'll caution is there are many different geraniums that are ground covers, and a lot of the ones that are like this, there's a variety called Roseanne that's very common in nursery trade. That's actually a European variety. It's not a native. So keep an eye for the one that's a native. There are varieties called Album, Elizabeth Ann, and Espresso that are varieties of our native geranium. So just keep an eye, make sure it's this maculatum, not something else, and then you'll make sure you're getting the one that's native to the Northeast. My absolute favorite ground cover is the moss phlox, Phlox subulata. It is a native to New York. It's available in multiple colors, pinks and blues and variegated. It attracts the pollinators with early blooms, but it really does a superb job as a ground cover. I much prefer it over mulch because it spreads over a big area, and you never have to renew it, and it takes no work. This is a plant where when it sheds its leaves, they just drop to the ground, and then it re-leaves out. So there's no raking up leaves. It's just out there as a ground cover. It does a superb job controlling weeds. The foliage is dense enough that the weeds and stuff don't come through it. And so like I say, unlike mulch, you don't have to replace it every couple of years. So if you're looking for a ground cover in the sun, this is a great plant. The golden Alexanders and heartleaf Alexanders with their lovely yellow flowers are another great spring plant. They're a host plant for black swallowtail butterflies. So they're another great spring flowering sunny perennial. So if we go to midsummer, when things that are blooming midsummer, the one thing I recommend that every garden include is some milkweed because it's the only host plant for monarchs. The foliage tends to be deer resistant. I used to think it was completely deer resistant, but I had a fawn in my yard last summer, and the fawn thought milkweed was actually very delicious, which is the first time I'd ever seen anything actually eat milkweed foliage. I have seen the deer eat the flowers, but I've never seen them go for the foliage. But I'm hoping. By the way, I never saw the fawn. My neighbor saw the fawn. I never did. I'm hoping that the mother doesn't do it again this year. Anyway, common milkweed is probably too aggressive for most gardens. This is one of those native plants that is really an aggressive spreader. Both through rhizomes and seeds, it can take over a garden. If you have a space, a forever wild space at the back lot line, or I visited a property one time where they had a garden next to the driveway completely contained by a retaining wall, and they let that whole little garden become common milkweed, and then because it couldn't spread beyond that. But otherwise, it can really spread too aggressively. So butterfly weed, which is the one that was on my title slide with the orange flowers, is a bushy milkweed that doesn't spread through rhizomes at all, may occasionally self-seed, but it's a very well-behaved milkweed for gardens, and the monarchs still like it. Purple milkweed, it looks like the common milkweed, but has lovely purple flowers and does not spread aggressively like the common milkweed does. And there's swamp milkweed that comes up, as you can tell, from swamps, but it will also tolerate normal soil. And there's a couple more on the list, but so we have a number of milkweed species native here. The one you'll probably find most often in nurseries is the butterfly weed. Another perennial I recommend for every garden for mid-season bloom is Joe Pye weed. It's much taller. In fact, the most common variety you find in nurseries is called Little Joe. That's still going to be like this tall, so it's not that little, but it's a great plant for the back of the bed. It'll tolerate moist to average soils. When these flowers bloom in midsummer, they're covered with pollinators at all times because they're really nectar and pollen rich. So you'll have butterflies because they're a nice flat flower, and bees and wasps and everything else. They are really a major nectar source and a superb plant if you want to get lots of pollinators coming into your garden. Some other mid-season plants, Pearly Everlasting has these lovely white flowers. It's a host for Painted Lady and some skippers. This is one of those great plants that illustrates that if you're going to grow native plants to be tolerant of some foliage damage. Early in the summer, my Pearly Everlasting looks really ratty. Almost every leaf is kind of curled up because there's a little caterpillar inside. So that the foliage looks really, it's one of those plants that's like, if you didn't know better, you'd go reaching for the bug spray because the plant looks really awful. All those caterpillars turn into butterflies. The plant puts out nice new foliage, beautiful flowers, and is perfectly happy with it. So it's used to that type of predation. It survives it. You get the benefit of all the butterflies. You get the nice white flowers when it blooms. Bee balm and bergamot also bloom midsummer. Monarda is a wonderful plant because it'll attract pollinators and hummingbirds. You get lots of different colors from white to purple and reds and things available, different heights. So the monardas and bergamots and stuff are a really nice midsummer blooming plant. And then finally, a few more here. Cardinal flower and great lobelia. The lobelias, again, they attract pollinators and hummingbirds. They do like moisture soil. The deer don't tend to browse these, so they're a little more deer resistant. And they're very attractive garden plants to have. And then Culver's root can tolerate average soil, attracts pollinators because these nice taller flowers. It does prefer like a more moist soil though. So that one, if you have really dry soil like I tend to have, I don't have that one in my garden because my soil is too dry for it. And then one that I hadn't heard about until a few years ago, but it's becoming a very popular native plant, are the mountain mints. They're not mints. They don't have that mint habit of invading everything, and they actually don't grow on mountains. So it's one of those cases where the common name, who knows where the common name came from, but there's about half a dozen different species native to New York. They're very attractive to pollinators because they have a long bloom time and lots of blooms and abundant nectar. And as a garden plant, they're great because deer tend to not like them. They've just come into the nursery trade in the last few years. So, but you find a lot of plants that native plant nurseries are featuring mountain mints now. I put some in my garden last year. They really are nice plants, very well behaved, very hardy. So it's something to look for as a plant that most of us a few years ago hadn't heard of, but are very nice for native plants. And if you want something extremely tall, cutleaf coneflower is one of our native coneflowers. This will grow about 10 feet tall. It's a lot of fun that in the winter, so I have this planted behind my garage, and by the end of the summer, it's as tall as the gutters. But at the moment, it's like this tall. I mean, it was bare dirt in the winter. It's one of those things where you kind of amaze people where you're like, where did that tree come from? It's like, no, it was bare. It was bare ground in the spring. It's 10 feet tall by late summer. It spreads slowly, but then the flowers, fortunately you can reach some of them for cutting and stuff. Attracts lots of pollinators. And it's just fun. That's something for you. You want something really tall for the back of the border or against the house, or like in my case, the back of the garage. This is a wonderful plant for disguising an area like that. Okay, let's go to late blooming perennials. This is actually something a lot of gardens don't have, and something that's very important because the pollinators are really looking for nectar this time of year. Because basically, like the bumblebees that are going to overwinter, the new queens have been thrown out of their mother's nest in the late summer. They're trying to fatten up so they can survive the winter. They need flowers at a time when a lot of gardens are kind of like petering out. So goldenrods are great. There's probably 8 or 9 different goldenrod species native to New York. They flower in early fall. They have lots and lots of pollen and nectar. The birds love the seeds later. They can tolerate dry soil once they're established. The deer don't tend to touch them. I know some people are like, well, what about allergies in goldenrod? I see smart people back there saying no. Yeah, goldenrod pollen is actually very large and heavy. It has to get moved around by a bee or other pollinator. What blooms at the same time as goldenrod is ragweed, and ragweed pollen blows in the wind. So people see the goldenrod blooming, they're sneezing from their allergies, and they don't realize it's not the goldenrod, it's the ragweed blooming next to it. So don't worry about putting goldenrod in your garden and triggering any allergies. That won't happen. So you can get the tall goldenrod, stiff goldenrod. There's a nice variety called Fireworks of our common golden. You'll find a lot of Fireworks goldenrod in nurseries. The pollinators will love you, and you get these yellow flowers at a time when the garden's kind of petering out. Another great late one are all the asters. There are probably more than a dozen different aster species native to New York. They bloom in the early fall, so they're great for pollinators. They are a host for butterflies and moths, so that they're a host plant as well for pearl crescent butterflies, for example. And then because there's like a dozen different species, do you want it tall? Do you want it short? Do you want blue, white, purple? You can really, whatever you want, you can find a native that'll do it. Do you want sun, shade? So anyway, I've listed 4 of the species here. There's actually many more than that in the plant list you're going to get. You'll probably find lots of asters, probably even outside in the CountryMax. They're putting in the plants right now. They're wonderful plants because they bloom late, so they're great for the garden. And then just a couple more late ones for sun. White turtlehead or bottle gentian are both lovely plants that'll bloom late in the summer. This one, the bottle gentian, the bumblebees love, because basically it takes the strength of a bumblebee to force that blossom open to crawl in and get the nectar. So it's a plant that kind of is designed for bumblebees. This one prefers moist soil. This one averages a moist soil. This one's deer resistant. So again, good late summer flowers for your garden. And then one last slide on some late bloomers. Sneezeweed, Helenium autumnale, is a great one. It attracts lots of pollinators. It's deer resistant. The one thing I'll caution is there are lots and lots of hybrid Helenium. You'll see something labeled Helenium in a nursery, and it may even say native plant, but it's a hybrid with a European or Asian or other species. So the one you really want to watch for is our native. Most of the other Heleniums are not native, and again, they've got double flowers and various odd exotic things. So if you're trying to be pollinator friendly, watch for that. On the other hand, if you want a pretty bouquet, some of the Helenium hybrids can make some really nice cut flowers. New York ironweed, one of our native plants, again, attracts lots of pollinators. It is deer resistant. It gets its name because once it gets established, trying to dig it or move it will be quite hard. It has a very tough root, but it's a nice plant. Okay, we're going to switch the shade. And I'm just going to caution, I'm going to start with talking about plants, what I'll call typical average shade. Might be the north side of your house, might be underneath a smaller tree or whatever, but the soil's not bone dry. I put a caution to beware of dry shade because I learned this the hard way. So if you get large trees, they create very dry shade. Like I've got in my front yard, I've got a huge silver maple, a big linden, and a Japanese maple. So these 3 big trees, and they've been there since the house was built in the 60s. I'm the second owner. So underneath there was no grass growing when I bought the house. And I was like, great, I'll put in a shade garden. Well, I discovered the grass wasn't growing for a reason. It was very shady, but also with those big trees, bone dry. There are plants that will grow in dry shade. We'll talk about those later, but there's a lot that won't. I'm going to start with the ones that won't, a lot of which I successfully killed in my front yard. So we'll talk about the ones for normal shade. We'll get to the dry shade in a moment. So some early plants for shade. Like I say, I have these now on the north side of my house and they're shady, so it's shaded more by the house than my trees, and they all do great. The baneberries, you can either get the red or the white. They're deer resistant. You get these very attractive berries. The foliage kind of looks like a stilby. The plant only grows about this tall, so they're very nice native plants. False Solomon seal has these lovely white flowers. Not quite yet. Right now the plants are this little things about this long. Then lovely red berries later in the summer. So that's a very attractive one. Jacob's ladder, either blue or pink or blue flowers. This one sometimes goes dormant in the summer. but it's very attractive spring plant. Solomon seal I mentioned earlier, that you can get a taller short variety. It has these arching stems with these little white flowers hanging underneath, so very attractive in the spring. Deer may browse it. I have an odd situation. I've got both the tall and short ones growing in a garden. The deer browse in the tall one and never touch the short one, and they're like only like 10 feet apart. I don't know if they don't like bending their head down lower or what it is, but you know. And by the way, this one will tolerate some dry shade. It grows well in normal shade, but this one will tolerate a little bit more dry environment. Bloodroot is pretty much done blooming already. It's one of the first early bloomers in the spring. So it has very attractive early flowers. The ants actually move the, if you have bloodroot popping up someplace else in your yard, because the ants are attracted to the seed. The seed actually has a little food package attached to it that's designed to attract ants. So the ants drag it off to their nest, eat the little food package, leave the seed, and then you get a bloodroot popping up someplace where you wonder how the seed got there. Foam flower is a lovely woodland plant. There's lots of different foliage variations. You might see many different foam flowers in the nursery because they pick different foliage variations, but they all produce the same lovely flowers and attract pollinators. So if we get into mid-season, something blooming in midsummer, bugbane is sometimes called black cohosh, is a beautiful bloomer. It gets 3-4 feet tall and then these big 1-foot flower spikes. The deer don't browse it, so it's very attractive, attracts lots of pollinators. There is a milkweed that will grow in the partial shade, poke milkweed. Again, it's another monarch host plant. It's supposed to grow in dry shade according to the plant list I see on the internet. It all died when I tried it in my dry shade garden, so I'm not sure I believe that, but that's what people say about it. And then woodland sunflower is another plant that surprised people. This one will get 4 or 5 feet tall, so we get some really nice height. Has these attractive yellow flowers. It's a host for silvery checker spot and painted lady butterflies. The deer in my yard, even last year with the fawn, nothing ever chews on it. So it's a completely deer resistant plant. So I'll talk about now some things for dry shade. These things for dry shade, of course, would grow in normal shade as well. But before I get to, let me talk about ferns a little bit. We have probably a dozen or more native ferns in New York State. This is just a few of them listed here. They're great plants for, as long as they won't grow in a dry shade garden, but in a normal shade garden, they're wonderful plants. They don't have a big wildlife value. A few are hosts for moths, and sometimes the dead fronds get gathered for nesting material for birds or whatever. But they are really very attractive, and they can add and sometimes stay green all winter, so they can really add a nice accent for your garden that looks very attractive. Okay, let's talk about that dry shade problem. There are fortunately some native plants that will thrive in dry shade. White snakeroot is one of them. It prefers partial shade, but it will tolerate the dry environment. It again blooms in the fall, so it's great for the insects looking for fall nectar. There's a chocolate native art that has chocolate foliage, so it's probably not a great host plant, but still produces nice blooms. Bowman's root will come up in the spring with nice spring flowers. Sometimes it gets very attractive red foliage in the fall. I have this growing in my shade garden kind of between the silver maple and the linden, and it's doing quite well. One of my workhorse plants for the dry shade are the wood asters. These totally laugh off the dry shade. I have these growing underneath the silver maple, and I literally have to occasionally go once or twice in the summer and pull some up because they would take over my whole shade garden if I let them. They really dry shade. It just doesn't bother them at all. They produce lovely aster-like flowers in the fall, so they're a great fall bloomer. The birds will eat the seeds. They're a host for pearl crescent and checker spot butterflies. So they're really, if you're looking for something, if you got that totally dry area, these will do just fine. The other thing that does well in dry shade are some goldenrods. There are goldenrods for shade, both the blue stem and zigzag. I've got both of these in my dry shade garden. Right, they're kind of competing with each other. The blue goldenrod, the blue stem, kind of moving toward the edge of the shade garden. The zigzag is taking over all the deep shade. This one grows underneath the linden tree right up to the trunk. So it really, it's its darkest shade close to the trunk, totally dry, and the zigzag goldenrod is in there blooming and growing and very happy. So again, it's a late season nectar and seed source. It's a host source of moths. So even if you have bone dry shade, you can't get grass to grow, you're really annoyed with it, there are native plants that will thrive in that environment. So talking about grasses, we also have lots of native grasses and sedges in New York. The tall grasses often host butterflies and moths. They add a nice architectural element to your garden. You want to leave the grass up all winter for winter interest, and just to let because it's probably little insects and things nesting underneath it. So really, I only cut my grasses down a couple of weeks ago. Really want to leave them up for a long time. Just a partial list of some of our native grasses: big blue stem, switchgrass, little blue stem, Indian grass. They're all lovely native grasses. So what about lawn replacement? What about really getting rid of the lawn and putting in native grasses? This is an area I'm just learning about. I'm experimenting in some parts of my yard, because a typical turf grass, of course, is a pollinator desert. There's not much there unless maybe you have a little clover blooming or whatever. It certainly is high maintenance for mowing and water and fertilizer and all that stuff. So our native sedges and grasses are certainly very low maintenance. They're very good for wildlife, and that most of the sedges are hosts for butterflies or host plants, and they provide shelter and nesting material. There are Carex, so probably the best thing for lawn replacement are the Carex sedges. And there are many, many native Carexes available, probably several dozen different Carexes that grow in New York State. They tolerate sun or shade, dry or wet environments you can be. I mean, not a single plant won't, but there's a sedge for each one of those environments. They can tolerate mowing, and a little bit of foot traffic, but this is not going to be a lawn where the kids can go out and play frisbee on. It'll tolerate light foot traffic, not heavy. The Mount Cuba Center, and this is so you'll get this link in the slides when you get it. Did a study on Carexes as lawn replacement. They did like a 4 or 5 year study where they studied Carexes for lawn replacement. In the last year, they even mowed them to see how they'd handle mowing. And so you'll have that reference, and you can give it, if you want to give it a try. If you want a lawn-like appearance but don't want turf grass, the sedges might be worth considering. I said, I'm trying some on a dry, shady spot, and the said that I've got a couple varieties that seem to be doing well, but I want to wait another year or two before I put up on a slide. But Mount Cuba's got a lot of data on replacing your lawn with something native. Okay, let's talk about some Eastern U.S. So I mentioned I would talk about plants that aren't native to New York, but are native to the Eastern U.S. that could make good garden plants. So there, as you can say, our native birds and insects have bigger native ranges than New York, so they're going to recognize these. I'm going to say, before you bring something home, check for its invasive status. So I mean, a lot of us, when we're traveling, you're in Ohio or Pennsylvania, you're on a car trip, and you see a local nursery, and you decide you're going to stop and do the plant shopping. I think many of us do that when we're traveling. So you might, for example, if you're in the native plant section in an Ohio nursery, you would probably find them selling cup plant. It's a beautiful prairie plant, but it's invasive here in New York. So before you bring something home from the native plant section elsewhere, Ohio, Michigan, whatever, just do a quick check to make sure you're not bringing home a problem, because there are plants like that are native to other states that are invasive here. These, I can promise you, are all well behaved, that are not invasive. So if you want something that blooms early in the sun, blue false indigo is native to Pennsylvania. It's a host plant for orange sulfur butterflies. Has these lovely blue flower spikes in the sun and grows about this tall. Has some nice seed pods in the fall. A very attractive plant. Penstemon digitalis is native to the Eastern U.S. There are some penstemon native to New York, but not the one you typically find in nurseries. You can find some different colors. It's a very attractive early spring bloomer. Of course, we talked about the purple coneflower on that earlier slide. It's native to the central U.S., including Ohio. It's been naturalized here in New York. So that's it. I did this on the earlier slide. Watch out for the many hybrids, but the native itself is a wonderful garden plant. Blazing star, Liatris, native to Pennsylvania for sure. It might be native to New York. If you go to our Flora Atlas, the status is listed as unknown. It grows about maybe this tall. I use it as an edge for a lot of my gardens because it will slowly spread. These spiky flowers are great, not just for bees, but for butterflies as well, because a lot of butterflies land on them. So it's a nice, attractive plant. Garden phlox is not native to New York. Phlox paniculata. It is native to Pennsylvania. So it's a banana, and that one, of course, other than the problem, sometimes powdery mildew and sometimes deer. It is a wonderful garden plant. And phlox comes in so many different colors. You can get all the, a wide range of colors. It certainly is covered in blooms in the summertime. Very attractive plant. My only problem with it is the deer. Let's say the deer browse it, but don't tend to kill it. It tends to come back from the browse. But depending on your deer density, could be an issue. And then for late season bloom, black-eyed Susan is a wonderful native plant to Pennsylvania. It's a host again, it's a butterfly host plant. At least for my yard, the deer don't touch it. So it's a very attractive plant. And then blue sage is a native to Ohio. It will tolerate very dry soil, be deer resistant, and give you these nice blue flowers. Okay, stuck to native plants for the whole talk. Is it bad to put non-native plants in your garden? No. You certainly, you can certainly create some interesting garden designs and different foliage and things. All of our spring bulbs, the daffodils and tulips that are blooming now, are not native, but the pollinators still like them. They can still be good native nectar sources. What I would say is, if you don't have any native plants at all in your garden right now, maybe it'd be nice if you get your garden to be like a quarter native. Or maybe if you got some, maybe you can have me go to a garden that's half native. You try and push your percentage up, but mixing some of these in, there's nothing wrong with that. If you really want to go for a strong goal, a lot of recommendations are, if you get to 70% native, then you've kind of gotten to the point where you've got a native ecosystem, and it's really good for the pollinators and the native wildlife. So if you can hit 70%, that's kind of an ideal goal. But even there, if you want to mix in a few, if you love peonies, no, they're not native, but peonies are beautiful. There's various favorite plants. Most of the roses aren't native. If you want to mix in something because you love it, you inherited from a parent or whatever, certainly do that. But if you can aim for more native plants, that's great. And again, annuals. Most of our annuals aren't native. They come from all around the world, but they're great nectar sources. They can be a good part of garden design. If you got a bed you want it to look different every year, an annual bed is a good way to have something that looks different every year. So if you want to put some annuals in your garden, there's nothing wrong with that either. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here and answer questions that you have. I mentioned that we have a website where you can get information. Our helpline is open 5 days a week right now. You can call them and leave them a message. You can also send them an email through our website, and they'll get back to you that way. And that's all advice is free. We're always happy to offer advice that way. And otherwise, I'll stop and answer whatever questions any of you have. Yeah.
So I've been in a few meetings and farms.
That's okay.
In my mom's garden, and she cut them down, and so the Bowman's root is coming back.
Mm-hmm.
But the butterfly weed is like gone. And I was like, I don't know, because I've never used it before.
Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah.
Butterfly weed, and actually all milkweeds, and I should have mentioned this on the slide, are what we call late emergent. They don't, okay. They're not up yet. Okay. And actually, so what I often recommend people either put a stake in the ground or take a picture with your cell phone or whatever, because you want to avoid the mistake I made where I planted something right on top of my butterfly weed one year because I was out planting in mid-May. It wasn't up yet. And this bare spot looked really good, and I stuck a shovel in the ground and found my butterfly weed. So yeah, it may be fine. It just isn't up yet. The milkweeds may come up. Well, we've been cold the last couple of weeks, so they may not come up now till late May. Or if we get a nice spell of warm weather, like it's going to get sunny at 60 to say, if we get some warm weather, you might see them come up sooner. But yeah, there are native plants that don't really get going till late. The milkweeds are one of them. So be patient. It might be just fine. Well, so most of our native plants, once they've been hit by a frost and they've died in the fall, you can cut them back. and it won't hurt them, but the recommendation is not to, because there's often insects overwintering in them. If the stem is hollow, there's things overwintering the stem, or just things around the base. So we typically use them up not so much to not hurt the plant, but for the benefit, but the benefit of all of the pollinators and native insects and things that are using them for shelter. But yeah, most of them will actually survive a cleanup. It's just nicer for nature not to. Yeah. Yes. Yes. It just didn't. It's on the list. It just didn't make my slides. Yes. Yes. Some of our we can't use the invasive word, but for many of our native there are some of our natives, whether it's common milkweed or others, they are aggressive spreaders, and you have to put them in a place where you don't either not grow them or put them in a place where you don't mind their spread or where you can control it. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the latest on the emerald ash borer? Because I've got a lot of young ash trees I want to try to protect.
You check our help. I'm not an expert on the treatments, but I'm sure our helpline can send you a fact sheet. I know that that you can have the trees injected, and I think that injection lasts a couple of years, but there might be a soil drench. I'm just not sure. I know for hemlocks there's a soil drench now that lasts for several years, but I mean they're definitely still around. So you're probably going to have to do something to protect the ash, and I think our helpline can probably send you a fact sheet on that.
Mountain ash.
No, mountain ash is actually, that's one of those common names. It's not in the same family, so it should be okay. There's some other diseases you can get, but I mean, this case where the common name has ash in it, but it's not in the ash family that the emerald ash borer is going after. Yeah.
We have some trillium flowers.
Yeah.
In the yard.
Yeah. It is. There's several different native trilliums. There's like 3 or 4 different native trilliums, and they're lovely. I didn't happen to include them in my talk because they don't tend to be available in nurseries very often. And digging them in the wild, you can on your property do whatever you want with yours, but it's illegal to go out and dig them in the county park or whatever else. But if you have them, you're really lucky, and that's great. Do watch. Sometimes the deer go after the foliage, so. But if they're not in your yard, then just be happy that's not happening. Yeah. But yeah, trillium are wonderful. That's knock on wood. Knock on wood. That's great. That's wonderful. Other questions?